Welcome back to our series on Plato, and my off center. Oh, that's not good. Welcome back to our series on Plato, episode 10. I'm just gonna say 10 and hope it's 10. Buckle up, we're gonna talk about something that's really integral to Plato's philosophy, and hopefully we can get through it and I don't screw things up. This opening's not going very well, is it? Anyway, we'll just jump in. You've seen the thumbnail, you know what the title is. Freedom and Knowledge. I'm going to lead you through the first Platonic dialogue in this Platonic dialogue, kind of. When you read it, you'll understand, the structure and why I'm saying that. But when Socrates first meets Lysis, he goes straight into question mode. 100% Socrates 100% of the time. And he begins by asking an amazing question. Do your parents love you? I just love the imagery of this 60-year-old dude just sitting down next to this child and just being like, man, do you like your parents love you? What's going on with your life? And Lysis answers, yes, my parents do love me. And he goes, okay, well, glad we got that out of our system. Would you agree that someone who loves you desires that you be free? Or does someone who loves you desire that you be a slave? Well, and Lysis doesn't even have to take time to think about it. He says, well, of course, someone who loves me desires me to be free. And he says, oh, so your parents, who you claim love you, they let you do whatever you'd like, right? You can do anything. And he goes, of course not. And Socrates goes, oh, I thought that they loved you, and if they loved you, they desired your freedom. So what sorts of things can you not do? And Lysis goes on to name things like, I can't go ride the chariot by myself. I can't do other things that are examples of stuff that I can't remember. But it's basically imagine a 12-year-old boy now. Oh, I can't go drive the car. I can't go stay up all night long every night and play video games. It goes on and on. I can't set my own curfew. I can't decide what food I eat, all the time. I can't decide which classes I'm going to do the homework for, things like that. And Socrates basically says, why? Why can't you do these things? If your parents love you and want you to be free, why are they telling you can't do these things? Lysis takes a minute and he thinks and he goes, well, I suppose it's because I'm not old enough or big enough, or, he comes up with things, and Socrates goes, well, are you incapable of being in a chariot because of your age? Lysis says, no, anyone of any age can be in a chariot. And he goes, okay, so it clearly isn't your age that's a problem. Or do you fit in the chariot? Are you big enough? And Lysis goes, nearly so, really. I mean, he can stand in the chariot. He's physically capable of standing in the chariot and holding the reins. And so Socrates goes, well then, if it's not your age and it's not your size, why don't your parents let you do these things? And Lysis is, he's sort of confused. He doesn't really have a good answer. And so Socrates asks, well, what do they let you do? What are the things that they particularly want you to do? Do they, I suppose you're an educated young man, and this is what comes next. Imagine Lysis's parents are illiterate. He says, when they need something written or read to them, they come and they ask you to do so, I'm sure. And Lysis says, well, of course. And if they want music to be played in the house, I'm sure they ask you to grab the harp and you're allowed to play whatever you want for as long as you like. I'm sure they don't put constraints on what you must and must not play. And Lysis says, well, sure. And Socrates says, why? Why do they let you make those decisions and not others? And Lysis says, well, I suppose it's because I understand language, I understand written language, and I understand music. I can do them. And Socrates thinks for a second. And he says, well, then I suppose it's really your knowledge, what you do and do not know, that keeps your parents dictating what you are and are not allowed to do. And Lysis agrees. And they go on from there. This is almost a baby step into how Plato's, what his view of knowledge and freedom and virtue and stuff sort of entails. And it's key to remember that when Lysis picks up his harp or whatever, his parents do not constrain him. He may play as he wills. That Socrates uses that wording. And this is coming from Plato, whose his philosophy more or less equates knowledge and freedom. And you can do what you know how to do, which I think is not a very difficult thing to agree to. I'm not wording that very well, but I think most people would accept the fact that you cannot do what you don't know how to do, and you can do what you do know how to do. Plato takes it a little step further, and he says, not just that, but you need to know how to do it well in order to be able to do it freely. One way of describing this is the way Socrates talked to Alcibiades in the last dialogue, where he says, when you don't know how to do something, whom do you consult? And he says, the expert. But when you're the expert, you don't consult, you just act. You just do as you know how to do. Now, certainly you can have some knowledge, but if you have some knowledge, ought you be allowed to just do as you will, or should you continue to seek guidance? And Socrates gets Alcibiades to agree that if there is any lack in your knowledge anywhere, you ought to seek guidance. But where your knowledge is complete, you have really no need of further guidance. Plato's going to take this further and say not only that you can do as you will, but that... where was I going to take this? Let me remember how I was going to word it. It's that in knowing how to do something well is what gives you the freedom to do so. Oh yes, it's not just that other people won't stop you. It's that you don't have to stop you. If you know what you're doing, you can do it. And we can equate this in a sense. Imagine you're learning how to... what's a fair thing? Or imagine you're learning a foreign language. When you're learning, say, Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, you go into the classroom and the teacher tells you this is how you say something. And it would be silly of you to demand, I should be able to speak Mandarin Chinese however I want. Well, your teacher might say, fine, and then you'll never be understood by anyone who speaks Mandarin Chinese. It is good for the person who is learning to imitate, to follow rules, to do as they are told to do, and not to exercise undue freedom. Imagine someone wants to speak English, but they don't like prepositions. And so they want to say something about the store, and they want to say, I go store. And you say, fine, I understand what you're saying, but you're not very good at English if that's how you're speaking. I go store. In theory, if you say, I go lake store, if you're trying to intend to say that you're going from the lake to the store, you've just made it impossible to communicate. You're not following the rules. In a sense, you don't know English well enough to be able to speak it. And in a sense, you are actually less free because you don't follow the rules. Because you aren't constrained, you are less free to express yourself. And this is the paradox that Plato's working with, is it's actually by accepting rightful limitations that we become free. It's by accepting the rightful limitations of language or music or art or chariot riding or whatever thing. It's when we know how to do it well, not just do it, but do it well, to have good form constrained by certain parameters. That's when you're free to do as you will. Plato says you're free to do as you will because once you know the good, why would you ever will anything else? And anytime you will the bad, it's because you do not know the good. Obviously, there are sometimes when I know perfectly well that I shouldn't do something, and then I go and do it. Plato would say, if you really knew that you should never do the bad thing, you wouldn't have done it. The reason you did the bad thing is because you've identified in some way that thing as good. Good for you in the moment, beneficial in some way. You've mixed up your priorities. Your knowledge is not complete. You've actually misidentified the hierarchy of goods and what outweighs what. And to know, if you truly knew deeply and believed and understood what was good, you would never act against it. And so, it's once you know the constraints of a form, once you know the constraints of the proper and the best way to do something, then you're free. And in a sense, you're free to experiment, you're free to toy with it, you're free to do as you will, to test things, to say, okay, I know the form, now let's see what the form can do. It's what, like when you learn a foreign language, at a certain point you've learned how to form a sentence, you've learned the form of what normal sentence looks like, and now you can use it however you want. You can start expressing things you didn't learn how to say in class because you've learned how the language works. And now you're just plugging in words and you're plugging in expressions and syntactical constructions. You can use the language freely. And you can even play with it. You can start to say jokes. And one of the big parameters for if you want to know, do you know a language very well, is can you understand and tell jokes? Because jokes are often playing with the language, playing with expectations. They're not funny if you don't have an expectation built around how the joke is worded that gets subverted. That's how most humor works. And so once you know the language's rules well enough and you've committed yourself, you've limited yourself to the rules of language well enough, it's when those get broken that you can see the humor. If you don't know the rules in the first place, you won't even know when they're being broken. And so this is why Plato equates knowledge and virtue. A couple things that flow from that is the idea that if knowledge is virtue, what is vice? Ignorance. And in a sense, if vice is ignorance, what that means to Plato is if someone wills the bad for someone else, if someone is malicious, if someone does something bad to another person, Plato would argue it's not because that person desires evil. They always are desiring a good. They've just misidentified the good. Self-gratification at the expense of another is not good. But the only reason you would ever act that way is because you thought it was. And so for Plato, forgiveness for Plato is easy in a sense because they didn't know better. If they had known better, they wouldn't have done it. And so it's more of a, not an anger or a retribution mindset, but almost a pitying mindset of, well, if only you had known that what you were doing was not good. And the desire for punishment is not for revenge, it's not to teach, well, it is, it's to teach them a lesson. In a sense, the meaning of punishment is to instruct. Socrates says as much at one point in, I believe it's the Republic, which we will get to, but it's a ways down the road. He says at one point, the wise man desires nothing but to be punished by a wiser man because they come to greater knowledge. Punishment is instruction. And so it's this mindset of, the idea of punishment, the idea of when someone does something wrong, how do you react to that? From a Platonic point of view, you react by instructing, by teaching, by trying to show that person what the good is, why what they did is not good, and how to get better. Anything else is not punishment, it's just malice. But of course you would only, according to Plato, you would only seek revenge or do malicious punishment that's not instructive if you thought that that was good. If you knew that instruction was the correct punishment, you would always choose instruction, you would never choose the other one. And anytime you did choose the other one, it's because in that moment, you had forgotten that this one's better. Whether that's for weakness or emotions in the moment getting in the way or something like that, something has clouded your reason and you've misidentified the good. You have sought what you thought was good. Plato would argue everyone is sincere insofar as everyone seeks good. Some people just identify the good for themselves with the harm of others. And so, in a sense, long story short, one of these Platonic ideas that works with is the idea that ignorance is vice. All vice comes from ignorance. All bad decision making is just based on ignorance. You don't know better. The flip side of that then is, of course, if you want to be good, what do you have to do? You have to learn. You have to have knowledge. And this is what ends up being called the well-formed conscience. You always have to follow your conscience. You always have to do what you think is good. Even if you're wrong, if your conscience tells you that's the good thing, that's the bad thing, you have to do what you think is good, because otherwise you are willing what you think is bad. And that is a terrible subjugation of truth and goodness and beauty, because now you are acting against knowledge, in a sense. You've identified the good with doing the bad, which is a terrifying cycle in reversal to get into. So you must always follow your conscience, but you have an obligation to form that conscience, to try and learn what really is good and true and beautiful and helpful and all these things that show, or not just show, but are knowledge of the forms, knowledge of good, knowledge of the reality of things. And so, to wrap up our discussion of friendship in the Lysis, to wrap up our discussion of friendship, here we are, freedom and knowledge. Knowledge is virtue. And virtue is freedom. It's the freedom to do as you will, because you have the knowledge to always will what is best. That's the goal of education and learning. So let's all strive to be truly knowledgeable and truly educated, so that we have the freedom to do as we will without worrying so much, because if we always will the good, then we don't have to worry about just doing what we want, because you'll always do what's good, because you'll always want what's good. So let's strive for that perfection, even though it's a long journey, but it's well worth it. Thank you so much for joining me in this series on Plato. If you'd like to see the next video in this series, go ahead and click right up there. If you missed it and want to see the previous video in this series, click over there. And if you like this content and want to see more, consider subscribing.